Hello friends, welcome to today's class. The topic of today's class is disaster management. So in today's class, we will be understanding about the concept of disaster and managing the disaster in its different phases. So what is a disaster? When we think of disasters, various things come into our mind. For example, we think of tsunamis, we think of floods, we think of industrial accidents like nuclear accidents, even wars. All these come into our mind when we think of disasters. But we have to understand that all accidents are not disasters, all natural calamities are not disasters, and all industrial accidents are all not disasters. But all disasters will be categorized into the following, which we just mentioned. So, how do we draw the line between what is a disaster and what is not? So, we have to understand that a disaster is an event which causes so much damage, so many lives are lost that the community or the people who are affected by that disaster, they cannot overcome on their own. Help from outside is warranted. Without help coming from outside, the situation cannot come back to the normal, that is the normal situation that existed before the disaster. So two features: one, extraordinary situation in which there is a lot of loss of lives and damage or destruction of property. Let us try to understand this with a simple example. Let us take the example of a earthquake. Now an earthquake which occurs in the desert, in which only there is a small village, and the same earthquake of the same magnitude which occurs in a densely populated area like a metropolitan city. Let us visualize the amount of damage that will be there. In the village, maybe a few houses or maybe all the houses will be broken. How many people will be killed? Maybe 5 people, maybe 10 people. When the disaster occurs, if it is during the daytime, then most of the people will be able to rush out of their houses, or most of the people will be they might be in the fields or something like that, they might be working. So even if the house collapses, then not much damage. Now the same thing, it happens in a city. High rise buildings are there, vehicles are going now and then, other activities are also, construction activities may be going on. So when disaster strikes at such a time, the loss of lives will be large, the property damage will also be very huge. So when an earthquake strikes in a densely populated area in a metropolitan city, this is a scenario when we can call it a disaster. Otherwise it will be just a not an accident, but it will be an incident. So even other examples, for example, a factory is there and gas leak takes in that factory. So at that time, not much workers are present and that factory is located away from that city. So that is not a disaster. That same accident, if it takes place near the city or within the limits of the city, a lot of people are killed, then that is a disaster. Now going to managing a disaster. How do we manage a disaster? So when we talk about managing a disaster, we should know that there are usually three phases in a disaster: the pre-disaster phase, the disaster phase, and the post-disaster phase. The disaster phase is also known as the impact phase. The various activities are undertaken during these three phases. In the post-disaster phase, usually the rebuilding or reconstruction activities are undertaken. In the pre-disaster phase, the measures are taken to mitigate the effects of the disaster. In the impact phase, just the rescue and relief operations are taken, and even those operations, they take place in the post-disaster phase only. During the impact phase, very little activities are undertaken. So now we will be looking into the management of the disasters with the different stakeholders involved, and there will be an interface that will be in place for the different stakeholders to interact and manage the activities of a disaster management plan.